Okay, so what we have seen is little introduction about FHIR yesterday. We saw the hospital workflow, which is a core where we have the entire data being transacted between different applications. We spoke about what is the problem that we have where patient is unable to have access to his data and how FHIR is solving that problem. So FHIR is adding a new layer upon the existing AHR database so that the data can be exposed to the outside world where other third-party developers and all can develop mobile apps or desktop apps and have the patient access to his own data that is present in the EHR system. And we have also seen that there is a second solution that can also be applied, which is to create a FHIR repository where we'll create a database and a FHIR layer. Uh, and the database will store all the resources within the FHIR repository, right? And then from there, the developers will go ahead and access the data through FHIR resources and develop mobile apps and desktop apps. So this is called as FHIR repository solution. Earlier one is called as FHIR facade layer, where you are adding a new layer on the existing HRDB. Then we talked about why we need FHIR, the evolving standards, evolving requirements within healthcare, need the FHIR to be to take birth or has enabled FHIR to take birth. And we talked about FHIR and what is a resource. We saw about the evolution of FHIR yesterday. We have seen what are the four paradigms of FHIR. We discussed about what is a resource, and we saw that a resource is highly focused data set for certain data category. For example, when we have the entire data in the hospital, uh, we can divide the entire data into different data sets: patient data, appointment data, encounter data, orders related data, result related data, diagnostics related data. So all of these data is present in the EHR system, but we can segregate them into small data sets. And each data set is called as is called as a resource. That is what we have seen yesterday. And in this way, there are around 156 data sets. Sorry, 150 plus data sets, not 156, but 150 plus data sets that can be present in the hospital environment, and each data set has its own name. So we'll see what all data sets are. So each data set is referred to as a resource, and that is what the entire FHIR specification will revolve around. So everything in FHIR is a resource. All the data sets are resources. If there is anything from administration perspective in FHIR, those are also called as resources. We'll see them in the future sessions. So we talked about resource, and we saw this page, and this is where we have concluded our session yesterday. So this is a sample patient resource example to see what all the data elements that we'll have in a resource. So there are 4 sections in any resource. Each one is highlighted in a different color here. ID and metadata is one section. Narrative is one section. Extension is one section, and the standard data, which is the actual data of a resource, is present in one section. And I gave a brief that there are 3 different resources. The resource will derive its structure from domain resource. Domain resource will derive its structure from base resource. We'll talk more about these combination of these 3 in today's session. But first, let us look at how this data is represented. So we will just pick one resource. We will explore that resource and understand all the concepts of FHIR specification for that specific resource. Once we understand all the concepts revolving around a resource, it is the same concept that will be replicating with other resources as well. Okay, so we'll go ahead and browse through our FHIR website. Where did this go? All right. So, unlike other HL7 standards, FHIR has done a fantastic work with respect to documentation. For earlier healthcare standards like version 2, CDA, or V3, we did not have very strong documentation, which will tell us this is what you have to do, this is what you have to follow, these are the examples, these are the probable implementations that you can go with, and all. Uh, all of those documentations were lacking with the previous versions, but with FHIR, the HL7 has done a fantastic job. They have created the FHIR website, and the documentation is very much handy. All that you have to know is where to start from. Okay, so if you're a beginner, go ahead to this resource page, and within this resource page, you'll have all the resources that will be available in FHIR. As I said, FHIR specification or FHIR data standard revolves completely around resources, right? So these are all the list of resources that we have. As I mentioned, we have 150 plus resources, and there are various views that you can go through. One is categorized view, where it will categorize the resources in based on certain categories. As you can see, these foundation resources are all administrative related resources, which means to manage the FHIR specification itself, we have various resources. So those are falling under foundation category. The main clinical related data or hospital related data starts from here, which is nothing but base resources. Under base resources, you have various sections again. Okay, if you talk about individuals, you have patient resource representing the entire patient data. Then you have practitioner resource representing doctor related or nurse related information. Then you have organization resource, which is going to represent the hospital related information. Then you have encounter related resource, where which will tell you about the encounter related information. So as I said in the beginning of today's session, the entire hospital's data is divided into different data sets. Each data set is represented in the form of a resource. Okay. So here you can see we have base resources, and then we have clinical related resources. In clinical resources, you have all the various types of clinical resources like allergies, observations, service requests. Then you have diagnostic report, procedures, conditions. So there are many various resources that will be part of clinical data resource. Then you have finances. So financial related resources are these. They are categorized this way, and then some specialized resources are also present, and they are present in the last grid. There are various views, as I mentioned. Categorized is the view that I go ahead and prefer. That is my preference, but it is up to you what you want to prefer. The reason why I prefer this is this will give me a preliminary information on what kind of or what category of data that I am dealing with. Okay. For example, if I talk about allergy resource, okay, as soon as I come here, I understand that this resource is related to the clinical data of the patient, which means as soon as I see that, I will feel okay, this is something related to patients' health related information or clinical related information that is being uh, transacted or that is being stored in this particular resource. Okay, that will help me from workflow perspective to understand where exactly this particular resource will come into picture. Okay, for example, observations are lab results, so these are clinical related, and it is showing that it is clinical related resource, which means I will relate back to the real time workflow to understand where this resource clinically it is used in the real time implementations. Okay, that is how it will be very much helpful for me in a category in this view. But if you want to quickly go through resources, you have alphabetical view, which you can use. You have old R2 layout if you want to use. You have something called as maturity. We'll look at what maturity is, but you have resources listed out based on maturity as well. So any one of the view can be used. but in our training, we'll be going through the categorized view. Okay. So now let us look at patient resource. Okay. So once we go through the patient resource, this patient resource will tell us what all the data elements that will be used in this particular resource. Okay. Usually when we talk about patient, what are the things that will get to our mind? Let me remove this. Yeah. Usually when we talk about patient, what all the details of the patient we capture in the real time, or what all the details that we will save in the EHR database or PM database, any database in fact. So we will be saying patient name, right? His last name, first name, middle initial. We will be storing his patient identifier, right? And we'll also have patient's address information. We'll have patient's email address, and then we'll have patient's language, and then we may have telephone number, patient's SSN number. In this way, there will be many demographic elements that will be captured or saved within the database, right? So what are we doing with FHIR? In FHIR, in patient resource, we are going to represent all of these data elements in a systematic format. Okay. And when you look at the patient resource will tell you what all elements are present within this particular resource. Okay. So we'll quickly run through the elements that we have. So when you look at the patient resource, in this patient resource, we have the standard data, and this standard data is representing identifier element, which means the patient ID or the MRN number, medical record number. Then you have the name of the patient, the phone number, the gender of the patient, his birth date, and then the address information, marital status, his photo, and then his contact information, his language information. So all of these data elements are present within the patient resource. Okay. Now, how this data is represented or how this data is transacted from one system to another. So when we talk about FHIR resources, they come into play when there has to be a transaction between two systems, right? Let's say EHR data is available and there is a mobile app that is being created, and this mobile app has to get the data from the EHR system to see the basic patient demographic detail. How do we get that information? So we have to get that information from the EHR database, and there should be a specific format that has to be used in order to exchange the data between the mobile app and the EHR application. So as per FHIR specification, there are three different formats that FHIR can support. One is XML, which is the regular traditional model of exchanging the data all over the world. Then you have the new JSON. I mean, new in the sense relatively new when compared with XML, but JSON is pretty much famous. You can exchange the data in the form of JSON, or you can also exchange the data in the form of turtle. So the data exchange that is happening between the mobile app and the EHR can happen in any one of these three formats. It is the choice of the implementer and the choice of the FHIR server which format it is supporting. Okay. But in our traditional world, for all the REST APIs, we are habituated to go ahead and use JSON because of its lightweight, immediately parsable nature when compared with XML. Most of the people prefer to use JSON, but it is not a restriction. You can use any one of them, either XML or Turtle if you want to. have zero knowledge about turtle. I heard about turtle for the first time after getting introduced to FHIR. So in our training, we are going to take a look at the JSON objects itself, because that is the mostly used format for exchange of data. Okay, so let us explore what is JSON a little bit, what is a JSON structure, and then we will jump on to uh, the entire resource structure in detail. Okay, so what is JSON first of all? So JSON is an acronym which stands for JavaScript Object Notation. So this is a native object for JavaScript. So these objects are created so that whenever you are using JavaScript language anywhere, it will be easy for you to navigate and access the values that are present within the JSON object. Okay, so how can you express a JSON object? So any JSON object can be present within two curly braces, and within that you will have key and value pairs. Okay, so there may be multiple pairs separated by comma. Okay, so if you look at any JSON object, first it will be present within a square within the curly braces, and within that you will have key and value pairs. These key and value pairs are nothing but key will tell you what is the name of the element, and value will tell you the actual value. For example, if we take patient name, so it will say patient name, and the value of the patient name will be represented here in the value section. It will tell you patient name is Dixon. And let's say we have patient gender, right? It will tell you the gender value. In this way, the entire data is represented in the form of key and value pairs, and these are called as keys and these are called as values. So whenever you look at JSON structure, this is the basic, very basic JSON object that we are seeing here. But as and when you proceed, you will see that there are few complicated objects. Or if you look at JSON structure in detail, it's not as simple as what you're seeing here. Let's take a look at one example. So this is one JSON object, right? Whatever is present within the curly braces, let me pull it out from here and paste it here. So if you look at this JSON object, we have the key and the value. Here is the key and the value. But here is the key, and you are seeing there is another object present within that. Okay. And here you have a name, and there is an array value that is present here. So apparently, this is not the only way of expressing a JSON object. This is the basic way of expressing a JSON object. Now, when you take a key and value pair, you have the key and the value against it. Now, the key can also have other things like arrays and objects. Okay, it not only contains a certain value, but it may also have sorry, it may also have an array embedded within it, or it may have an object within it. Let's see that. So let's take name itself. Within name, sorry, within name, we'll have our last name, we'll have our first name, we'll have our middle initial. So there are three more elements that should be part of name. So what you can do is you can add a new object altogether. As I said just now, a key in JSON can have a value, it can have an object, it can have an array. So we are taking a look at the second option now. which is nothing but having an object within the key. So this key element name has uh, last name, and then you will have first name, and then you will have middle initial. Just give me 1 minute, guys. Why is it not showing in the correct format?
Last you were not fairly perfect.
Right. What's wrong with this? Yeah. All right. So this is our JSON object, right? So whatever we have, the key value pairs, they will be present as key and then the values. And we looked at another example where we have an object. So any element or any key might have subsequent associated objects within them, and those objects will internally have separate key and value pairs. You may have further objects that are present within these keys as well. So there is no restriction that you can have only one object at this point and there shouldn't be any objects furthermore. Okay, so nested objects can also be there. For example, if you take prefix, let's add another element here called prefix. And I would say this prefix value will have two more objects, two more elements within that, or two more key value pairs, uh, prefix 1 and prefix 2. I'm just adding a random example. Okay, so in this way, object within an object, so this is a new object that is present within another object. So in this way you can have multiple objects or nested objects present when you want to represent a JSON JSON representation or JSON object. Okay, this is about objects. Now you may have another option where you will have to or you may have a scenario where you may have an array value. So what is an array? When you have the same data element repeated multiple times, then you will have that value in form of array. For example, a phone number, right? So phone number of a patient might be repeated multiple times, right? So you will have an array representation always in the form of square brackets. and an array will be there, and you will have your phone number repeated as many number of times as you want. Okay. Array itself can also have objects. All right. So let's take phone number itself. I want to go ahead and specifically say that phone number, first phone number is cell phone number. Second phone number is my home phone number. How do I represent that? So I'll take phone number itself, and I would say, so I will remove this one. So I would say it is an array, and within that array, I'll have two objects. Instead of having the values directly, I can have two objects separately. So one object representing my home phone number, another object representing my cell phone number. So in this object, I would say the number, and the number would be some value. But I will also have something called as category, which would tell me it is home phone. Okay, this is one object. And in the second object, I'll have number again, and I will have category again. Number will have some or the other value, and the category says it is cell phone. Okay, so in this way, whenever you are looking at any JSON object, this is the representation that you will have. Key value pairs is one, key and an object as a value, that is second one, key and an array as a value, that is the third one. These arrays might have individual values directly, or it may have objects embedded within those arrays. Okay, this is the basic representation of JSON format. So whenever we are exchanging data between our mobile app and the EHR system, the data will be transacted in the JSON format. As per FHIR specification, every JSON object that we are going to create should have one mandatory element, which is nothing but the resource type. Okay, so this is explicitly for JSON. In XML and Turtle, you might not be seeing this, but specifically in JSON, we have to specify the resource type. And what do we specify there? If we are talking about a patient resource, we'll specify the patient resource. If you are talking about, or if you are transacting an encounter resource, then you will specify the name of the encounter resource. In that way, depending on the transaction that you are making, there will be a certain resource that you will be working with. So that resource name has to be specified in the resource type always. Okay, this is as per the basic JSON structure expressed by FHIR specification. I'll quickly show you. So if you go to this home page here, they specified the base foundation documentation. In this, if you go to JSON, you open the JSON documentation page, and in JSON documentation page, the first element is always mandatory. Okay, so the resource type should always be there in, if you are expressing a resource in the form of JSON. If you are using XML, it's not needed. Okay, and here they have all the rules that we have discussed just now. What is, I mean, they have expressed various properties. You can have the normal property, and then you can have an object, then you can have an array. We'll talk more about codable concepts and other things later. One other thing is, if you have this R symbol expressed in the JSON structure of a resource, it means that that's a required element. Let's quickly take a look at an example. So this is a patient resource structure, right? And if you go to JSON of that particular patient resource structure, Here you can see that we have R, which means language is mandatory. Here you can see R, which is nothing but the other link is mandatory. And do we have it anywhere else? No, we don't have it anywhere else. So in that way, if you have that R symbol, then that means that that particular element is a mandatory element. Okay. So now that we understood the structure of the JSON, let us go ahead and see the resource structure and understand what are the elements that are involved and how this resource structure is expressed in terms of JSON. This is just a sample example that we have seen. This is not the exact format of the patient resource that we will be transacting in FHIR. FHIR has its own dedicated structure, right? So let's go ahead and explore that structure. So I'll pause here for a minute. Any questions from anyone? All right, I'm not hearing anything. So let us go ahead and continue. So when you look at the FHIR specification, as you go through the resource pages and you browse through resources, every resource has certain structure that it will follow. Yeah, we'll talk about all the icons, all the representations down the line, Mike. We have, there is a lot about other um, so Mike is asking a question, what is C? It is conditionally required. So we'll talk about that later down the line when we talk about other icons as well. So we have a lot of icons and lot of representations. We are going to look at each one of them one by one. Okay, the reason why I specified about R is if you are looking at this structure, it will tell you specifically that this element is required. Usually we don't browse through the JSON structure unless it is required. Most of the time we will go through this page. And here also you will have the representation of required, not required in the form of cardinality. But we'll see all the symbols and all the icons as and when we proceed with the resource structure. So when you look at the list of resources that you have, every resource will follow, every resource page has a specific format. Initially, first they will explain about the scope and usage so that you can get little brief on what this resource is used for, in what all contexts this particular resource is seen in real time. So that brief scope is given. Uh, in few resources like appointments and all, they have explained the workflows too. Okay, just give me 1 minute, guys. All right, so for every resource they have specified the scope and usage. For few resources they have clearly specified the workflows as well, especially in terms of encounter and sorry, appointment and observations, so that we will get basic idea of what that resource is used for and in which context it is used for. Okay, and then you have one paragraph or one section where it will show you what all uh, resources are interrelated with each other with this particular resource. Okay, we'll talk about resource references in the future sessions. Once we talk about resource reference, you will understand why these resource names are mentioned here. Okay, there are many resource names that are interlinked and They are mentioned here. We'll talk about them later. Then you have the resource content, which is the main structure of the entire resource. So you will be able to figure out what all elements you have as part of your resource by looking at this structure. Okay, and then after that you'll have your terminology bindings. Once we get to terminologies, we'll understand what terminologies are. Uh, but it will tell you what all the terminologies that will be used in this particular resource. And then at the bottom there are few workflow related scenarios, how to handle linking patients and all. But at the bottom of the page you will have something called as search parameters. Okay, these search parameters will tell you what all how to search for patients based on certain parameters. So we are going to perform that exercise once we complete the patient resource structure. So let's go back to the resource structure and explore more on the structural perspective. So whenever you are looking at resource structure, we have basic elements that will be there whenever you are capturing any patient resource in the PM system or EHR system, or whenever you are going to get the data, the patient data that is present in the EHR system or PM system back to your third party mobile app or desktop app. All the data elements that are there in the real time will be sent to you in this particular structure. Okay, and this structure will tell you how the JSON will be represented or how the format of the data that you will be receiving on your side. So every element that has three main columns here. One is flags, second one is cardinality, third one is the type. So flags will tell you some specific information based on the icon that is represented there. So each icon that is there has a specific use or specific use case. Cardinalities will tell you whether that particular element is required or optional or repeatable in that particular resource. So every element will have a cardinality which is expressed in terms of zeros and ones or zeros or stars. So we have various expressions there. We'll talk about that. And then you have the type, which will represent the data type. One of the most important factor on how the structure of the JSON would be is purely dependent on the data type that is assigned to an element. Okay, and finally you have the descriptions column. In descriptions column, you will see a brief note on what this element is all about, and if there are any other rules associated with that particular element, that will be present in the description section. So these are the four main columns. We will start with cardinality. We will understand what cardinality is. Then we will jump on to data types to understand what data types are. Then we will come back to flags. Okay, because without understanding cardinalities and data types specifically, we won't be able to understand what flags are. So we'll come back to flags later. First, we'll start with cardinalities. So as we know, these are the common elements when to represent a patient identification related data or patient demographic related data. Every element has cardinality, as I said. This cardinality will tell you whether an element is optional or required. If you see the lower level, which is nothing but this is the minimum number of times this particular element can have, and this is the maximum number of times that particular element can be there in the resource structure. So if it is 0, it means that it is okay even if this element is not there. If it is 1, then if the minimum number of occurrences is 1, it means that that particular element has to be there at least once. Okay, and if it is 1 on the other side, which is nothing but on the maximum number of occurrences, it means that you can have this element only once and not more than once. Okay. And if you have a star value, it means that you can have the element as many number of times as possible. Okay. So that's what the minimum and maximum occurrences uh, refer to. So if, for example, if you look at identifier, it says zero to many, which means you can have, if you don't want to have an identifier in your resource structure, it's okay. As per the specification, it's okay to not have that element altogether. And if you want to have an element, there is no restriction on how many number of identifiers you want to represent. Let's say within the hospital premises itself, patient data is registered and patient has patient ID, MRN number, some other external patient ID and all. Okay. All these identifiers, there are three different identifiers: MRN number, patient ID, external ID. These are three different identifiers. All three identifiers can be represented in the identifier section, or within the identifier element. Okay. So that's the reason, wherever there is a possibility of element or the data, or wherever the possibility of repeating the data is there, you will see that the identifier, you will see that that element will have as star. So while writing the FHIR specification, they have kept in mind that data repeatability is considered, and wherever the data can be repeatable, they have made sure that it is given as star as maximum number of occurrences. Okay. And then you have, next you have active. Active represents whether the patient resource or the data that you're seeing is active or not. So you can have this element if you want to in your JSON resource structure. If you don't want, then you can eliminate that. That's not a mandatory field or mandatory element. But if you're having it, you can have it only once. You cannot have multiple repetitions of this data element. That makes sense, right? Well, it can have only one value, whether it is active or inactive, right? There are no other possibilities uh, of having multiple elements in there or multiple values in there, right? Next you have name. So name can have zero repetitions, or name can be having multiple repetitions as well. So it says zero to many, which means it's okay even if you don't have name. So few people asked me why we have a situation where we have the cardinality of zero for name. So there will be few situations where name of a person will not be transacted. Name of, in cases of veterinary, name of animals won't be there. So in to make sure that everything is satisfied within FHIR specification, they did not make name mandatory. Okay, that's the reason they have mentioned name as zero. So even if you have a scenario, if you are having a data that has to be transacted for an animal, it may not have a name. That in that situation, name element is not necessary. Okay, but that animal might have a dedicated patient ID or MRN number, so that there will be a record for that particular animal, right? So that's the reason we have a name as zero. And another question that we may get is why name is having zero to many relation, which means why can we have, I mean, what scenario we can have name repeated? Usually we have our formal name, we will have our casual name or nickname as well, right? So to make sure that if the patient has more than one name, which is his formal name or casual name or nickname, this repetition is given here, that name will be represented, and it is a repeatable value. Okay. In that way, cardinalities will tell you whether all the elements that you have, whether they should be there in the resource structure or not, can be determined based on the minimum number of values that you have. If the minimum number says 0, then it is not a required element, it is an optional element. If the minimum number of requirements says 1, then it is a required element and it has to be there for sure. And on the maximum side, it will have 0, 1 or star. If it says, sorry, on the maximum number of site, it will say 1 or star. If it has 1, it means that you can have it only once. And if it says star, you can have as many number of repetitions as you want. There is no restriction. Okay. So that's what cardinalities represent. We'll talk more about cardinalities with examples tomorrow, and we'll continue taking a look at the data type. Okay. So once we complete the resource structure, understanding of resource structure, we'll jump on to see what is domain resource and what is base resource. Okay. So we have that coming up. So I'll pause here. Any questions from anyone? All right, I'm not hearing anything. So let us go ahead and conclude today's session here. We'll continue tomorrow with cardinalities, data types, and understand how resources are built. Okay. All right. Thanks, everyone. You all have a very good day.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Yes, thank you.